My husband had always made one thing clear. I was never to set foot on his farm. He said it was a place haunted by painful memories, locked up and long forgotten. And I believed him, because I was his wife. But then he died suddenly, and the lawyer handed me an old, rusted key with just 5 words. "It's yours now." I was planning to sell it, but something made me want to see it first, just once. When I opened the door, what I found inside stopped me cold. Because the truth was, I had never really known the man I called my husband. I had always been the obedient wife, at least until David passed away. He was a sharp, composed, and intensely controlling financial investor. He had his own rules, his own off-limits boundaries that were never to be crossed, and I, out of long-conditioned habit, never dared to question them. Over the years we lived together, I learned to keep quiet when he was tense, to yield whenever he made a decision, and to pretend not to notice the signs I should have seen much earlier. Of all the things he forbade, the one he made most painfully clear, repeating it so often it became ingrained in my mind, was that I was never, under any circumstance, to go near his family's old farm. I remember that evening vividly. The air carried the scent of red wine and seared foie gras. I had spent more than 2 hours preparing the meal, hoping we could finally sit down together without being interrupted by business calls or a last-minute meeting. But the moment David stepped through the door, I knew that hope had been naive. He walked in mid-conversation, his voice firm and cold, never once looking at me, as if my presence in the house was nothing more than silent background noise. He put down his briefcase, took off his watch, opened his schedule, each action brisk, mechanical, and emotionless. I walked over, trying to keep my voice gentle, just like I always did. "It's been a while since we had dinner together. I made your favorite." He glanced at the table but did not smile. "I just came to grab some documents. I told you, it's a last-minute trip." I pressed my lips together, trying to keep my voice from trembling. "You won't be home this weekend either? You've been away so often lately." He looked up at me. His eyes were not angry, but they held no warmth, only a clear, deliberate detachment. In that moment, I knew that no matter how hard I tried to hold on to what little was left of our family life, it would never be enough if I was the only one trying. I sat down in the chair and pulled out an old map I had once found tucked among a pile of documents he had forgotten. On the map, a large area was marked by hand with the words, "Walker Farm." I pointed to it and asked carefully, "Your family's old farm? Why did you never let me go there?" That seemingly harmless question immediately changed the look on David's face. He froze for a second, then turned away, his voice dropping low. "Sarah, I've made it clear. You're not allowed to go there. Not ever." I was slightly taken aback by the intensity of his reaction. "But it's your property. I was just curious." He spun around suddenly, his eyes cutting through the space between us. His voice rose, no longer controlled. "That place is filled with death. My parents died there. I closed the farm for good. Don't bring it up again." His words hit me like a slap. I went silent, but there was something I couldn't ignore, something he couldn't quite hide. After he spoke, his eyes flicked toward the window as if he was afraid someone might be listening. That wasn't the reaction of someone grieving the past. That was the reaction of someone hiding something. I didn't say another word, but in that moment, for the first time in our marriage, I felt that something was wrong. Not just with his answer, but with the strange fear that crept into his voice. And for once, I didn't push that feeling away. I let it stay in my mind, like a small seed waiting to grow. I didn't know that day would come so soon. A few days after that evening, I received a phone call early in the morning, just as I was pouring my first cup of coffee. On the other end was a man's voice, deep and firm, though he seemed to be trying to sound gentle. "Is this Sarah Walker?" I confirmed without thinking, then fell silent, listening. "We're very sorry. Your husband's car went off a cliff along the North Creek Pass. We haven't found a body, but the license plate and personal belongings in the vehicle have helped confirm the identity. You should come to the site to sign for the recovered items." I don't remember if I dropped the phone or collapsed onto the table in shock. All I remember is the wind through the window that morning and how cold it felt, even though it wasn't raining. Images came flooding into my mind like a wave of thick mud, jumbled and heavy. The way David had left in such a rush, the tension in his voice, and that warning about the farm still echoing in my head. I couldn't believe it. David had never been a reckless driver. He was never in a hurry, and he would never take a dangerous road without good reason. So, was this truly an accident? Or was it something else I hadn't yet found the words for? 3 days later, I went to the lawyer's office to complete the inheritance procedures. My husband's personal attorney, Mr. Clarence Moore, greeted me with an expression I couldn't quite define. It seemed more like forced regret than real sorrow. He pulled out a chair for me, opened a thin folder on the desk, then looked up. "I'm very sorry, Mrs. Walker. But at this time, Mr. David's estate shows no remaining assets." I stared at him in disbelief. Clarence cleared his throat and continued. "About 1.5 years ago, he withdrew all his investments just as the market took a sharp downturn, which led to substantial losses. A few privately held properties were also sold off to cover the damage." I gripped the arms of the chair to stop my hands from shaking. "What about the farm?" I asked softly. Clarence kept his voice steady. "It was liquidated 2 years ago. According to the records, that property has not been under Mr. David's ownership for quite some time." I sat frozen. All of my senses felt numb. I looked at him, waiting for something more to be said. I needed a footnote, an added explanation, anything that could help me understand why I, his legal wife, had never been informed about such a complete loss. He had never said a word. I could still recall David telling me just last month that he planned to keep the farm as part of his family's legacy. Clarence stayed quiet for a few seconds, then gave a small nod to an assistant standing in the corner of the room, as if signaling something. I noticed that, and I especially noticed the brief flicker in his expression when I repeated my question with a firmer tone. "He never told me anything about selling the property." Clarence didn't answer right away. He gave a slight shrug and said something vague. "We only process the paperwork as instructed by our clients. My condolences." But his eyes dropped, avoiding mine. And in one brief moment, I saw him glance at the assistant before quickly closing the folder. I didn't know exactly what I had just seen, but I was sure of one thing. David never told a half-truth. He either spoke plainly or stayed completely silent. And now, both the truth and the silence were gone, leaving behind empty spaces that felt like they might swallow me whole. I started to feel that the accident might not have been the end. It could have been the beginning of something far more terrifying. I went back to the lawyer's office on a drizzly afternoon, not because I needed to confirm anything, but because the unease inside me had grown unbearable. I hadn't slept in days. My eyes were dark with exhaustion. My mind was spinning, and my hands kept clenching and releasing without me realizing. But when I sat across from Clarence, I didn't let the desperation show too clearly. What I needed now was the truth, not sympathy. I looked him straight in the eye. My voice was hoarse from fatigue, but every word was clear. "You know something, don't you? Please, tell me. I've lost everything. There's nothing left for me to lose." Clarence glanced away and slowly shook his head, as if trying to avoid a confrontation in that moment. "You're upset. I can't say anything beyond what's in the file." I slammed my hand on the table. The sound cracked through the quiet room, making the assistant outside turn in surprise. David wasn't the kind of man who would easily give up his family's legacy. "If you won't talk, I'll bring in legal support. I'll dig through every file, every transaction page by page. I'm not bluffing." Clarence let out a sigh. It wasn't the kind of sigh someone makes when they feel threatened. It was the kind that comes before letting go of a moral line they've tried hard to hold. He hesitated for a few seconds, then opened a drawer and took out a small piece of paper folded in thirds. There was only one messy handwritten line on it, with no name, no date. I glanced at the writing, but before I could ask, he spoke quietly, as if afraid the entire room might hear. "I shouldn't be doing this, but from what I know, David had a safety deposit box at the bank. It was set up years ago and has never been closed. The main key was disabled during a contract renewal, but he might have kept a backup." I looked at him, waiting for the rest. Clarence lowered his voice almost to a whisper. "There was a time he mentioned it, just briefly, something about hiding the key somewhere in the library. I think it was inside a red book with a Latin title. I don't remember exactly." I didn't wait another second. As soon as I left his office, I went straight home and began tearing through every shelf in David's study. The books were tightly packed: finance, investment, philosophy, and stacks of technical documents all neatly arranged. But I wasn't looking for knowledge. I was searching for traces of a man who had hidden something from me, and hidden it well. I didn't stop until my eyes landed on an old, dark red book with no illustrations. The title was embossed in gold, Veritas Occulta. I didn't know what it meant in Latin, not until I opened it. The first page was blank, the second also blank. But by the third, I noticed the spine felt thicker than usual. I slipped my fingers inside and pulled out a small brass key, dusty and slightly tarnished. I went to the bank the next morning. When I handed over the key and gave David's name, the clerk checked the records and led me into a private room. The box was retrieved from the vault with practiced ease. It wasn't heavy, but as I opened it, I felt my heartbeat quicken. Inside was a thick folder wrapped in leather, an iron key older than the one I had brought, a silver-toned film photograph, and a sheet of paper folded in half. I opened the folder first. The documents confirmed that the Walker farm was still registered under David's name. There was no indication of any transfer or liquidation. I picked up the iron key next. It was long, the kind used for traditional gate locks. Finally, I unfolded the sheet of paper. For a moment, I forgot how to breathe. It was a photograph of David holding a young woman with chestnut hair, pale skin, and eyes smiling directly into the camera. They were standing in front of a wooden farmhouse with a neatly trimmed lawn below them. I turned the photo over. David's handwriting appeared, instantly recognizable. "Hold on to my happiness." I thought my heart had already died once, on the day I was told David had passed away. But it hadn't. That death was only a trap dressed up as grief. This time, it was my own hands that uncovered the betrayal. And my heart didn't melt. It shattered into pieces, small and sharp, falling silently across the stillness of the bank's vault room, where the truth had been waiting all along, needing only someone hurt enough to dare open it. I drove for nearly 3 hours from the city to the place marked as David's old farm. During the entire ride, I imagined the scene over and over again: desolate, cold, overgrown with wild grass, walls stained and peeling, windows buried under a thick layer of dust. I pictured myself stepping through a rusted gate, crunching dead leaves underfoot, and using my elbow to push open the creaking door of an abandoned house. But when the car turned onto the narrow road leading to the farm, I hit the brakes in shock. The outside looked nothing like I had imagined. The grass was freshly cut, the white wooden fence still smelled of new paint, and there were blooming lavender bushes beneath the windows, clearly watered with care. The roof was intact, spotless, with no moss or visible damage. I looked around, my heartbeat picking up. If this place had been abandoned for years, then who was living here? Who had been taking care of it? I stepped out of the car, my hand still gripping the old iron key I had found in the deposit box. In front of me stood a 2-story wooden house in a traditional style, with warm, yellow lights hanging on the front porch. There was no sound of barking dogs, no voices, but every detail spoke for itself. Someone was living here, and they weren't just staying temporarily. This place was someone's home. I stood at the front door for a long time, torn between walking away or stepping into a truth I wasn't sure I was ready to face. But I put the key in the lock anyway. It turned smoothly. The first thing I saw as the door opened was the warm glow of a crystal chandelier hanging from the ceiling. The wooden floor shone without a trace of dust or dampness. The living room was tastefully arranged, with beige linen sofas, a thick wool rug beneath the coffee table, and a neatly organized bookshelf. But what made me stop in my tracks was the fireplace across the room. Sitting on the mantel was a long row of framed photographs. I moved closer, each step as careful as if I were walking across thin ice. Every photo felt like a blade pressing deeper into my chest. The man in the photos was David. There was no mistaking him. The same smile, the same eyes, the familiar, effortless posture. But standing beside him was a young woman with long hair and pale skin, along with a boy around 7 years old, laughing brightly. My hand trembled as I reached for the third frame. It was a photo of the 3 of them on Christmas Eve. In the woman's hands was a red stocking embroidered with the name David Jr. I turned the frame over. David's handwriting appeared in blue ink, clear and unmistakable. David Jr.'s first Christmas. My heart tightened. I stepped back, still holding the frame. My throat felt like it was being squeezed shut. David Jr.? He was David's son, his child, not mine. And the woman beside him was the same girl from the photo in the safety deposit box. I hadn't even put the photo back on the mantel when I heard footsteps coming from the kitchen. I turned around instantly, every muscle in my body tightening. A young woman appeared, still holding a soup ladle in one hand. Her hair was tied back neatly, her face showed a hint of surprise, but she managed to stay composed. She looked at me with a polite but cautious gaze. "I'm sorry, who are you? Is there something you need?" Her voice was soft, not unfriendly, but it was clear she hadn't expected anyone to be in the house. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to say, then finally stammered, I'm looking for David Walker." She paused, then her expression softened, as if realizing there had been some misunderstanding. "My husband, he's away on a business trip. He'll be back soon. And you are?" I looked up and met her eyes, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "I'm Sarah Walker, David Walker's wife." She fell completely silent. Not a word came out. Her eyes stopped on my face, then dropped to the family photo still in my hand. I saw her lips pressed together like she was about to ask something, but nothing came out. Emily stared at me, stunned, then let out a short laugh, as if what she'd just heard was impossible. "What are you talking about? His wife? Wife of who?" I looked at her without blinking. "I'm Sarah Walker, David Walker's legal wife, on paper." She stepped back half a pace, shaking her head over and over. "No, you've got it wrong. David told me there was a woman who used to control all his finances, always prying into his personal matters, But that was his sister. He said she was uptight and always asking questions, not his wife. I clenched my hands, trying to keep calm. He said I was his sister. And you, who do you think you are in his life? I'm his wife. I've lived with him for 7 years, in this very house. I gave him a child, David Jr. He's 7, just started 1st grade. 7 years. I repeated it silently in my head. David and I had been married for 9. She started trembling. I looked her straight in the eyes. You didn't know he was married? Not once in those 7 years did he mention having a wife? I thought he was single. He told me he'd once loved a woman who was too controlling, who suffocated him, made him feel like he couldn't breathe, so he cut ties completely. He said after that, they had no more connection. He never told me he was married, not once. She began to cry, but I felt no relief. I stepped toward the table and pointed at the frame still in my hand. Do you know where I found this photo? She looked at it, her eyes fixed on the words written behind the frame. David Jr.'s first Christmas. I pulled from my pocket a photocopy of the household registration with David. I held it up in front of her. This is the marriage certificate, mine and David's. The date is 9 years ago, 2 years before you met him. She stared at the paper, her hands gripping the hem of her shirt. So, it's all true? I was just the second one, the one in hiding. I didn't respond. She sank into the chair. Then, all those weekends he said he had to travel for work. Was that to be with you? No. Every weekend, he told me he had meetings with clients. And I stayed home, still believing I was the only woman he loved. Turns out, neither of us meant more than the other. We were both deceived. Emily looked up, her voice barely holding together. Did you have a child with him? No. So, he chose me to have the child, but chose you for the paperwork. He planned everything, didn't he? I don't know. All I know is that man was never real, and neither of us was ever the only one. She said nothing. Tears streamed down her cheeks. I didn't say anything either. The room suddenly felt small, cramped with too many truths arriving all at once. There was no need for shouting. The words we had just spoken were enough to expose everything. And in the stillness that followed, I realized something. From this moment on, she and I were no longer strangers. We were 2 women betrayed by the same man. And maybe this was only the beginning of the truth. Emily and I sat across from each other in the living room, filled with early afternoon light. The silence stretched long after the shock had passed, leaving both of us drained. But I knew that silence wasn't the way to understand the man we had both once trusted. And I knew that if there was any place David had left behind something that truly revealed who he was, it had to be inside this house. My voice was rough with exhaustion when I asked her, "Is there any cabinet or safe in this house that only he could open?" Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, there's a wooden cabinet with a combination lock. He told me never to touch it. Said that's where he kept investment contracts and personal papers. I asked once and he told me women shouldn't worry about money, so I never dared to go near it." I looked at her, unsure whether I wanted to laugh or be angry. We stood up and walked toward the small study at the end of the hallway. The cabinet stood in the corner, about chest high, with the digital lock still lit. Emily pulled out her phone and entered their son's birth date. Nothing. She tried David's birthday. Still nothing. I stood still, then typed in the last 4 digits of the date David and I got married. The lock clicked open. There wasn't much inside. A few stacks of papers, a gray folder, and a brown leather notebook tied with a string. I took out the notebook first. I didn't have to flip far. My name appeared on the 4th page. I began reading each line aloud, my voice unsteady but clear. Need to get out. Dead is closing in. If I wait any longer, everything will collapse. I have to be decisive. The plan is to fake an accident. Sarah will take the fall. She has enough assets to cover it. Legal wife, all the paperwork is in her name. No one will suspect a thing. After 3 months, the insurance will pay out. I'll move everything into the Cayman account, then start over with Emily and our son. I paused, hand still holding the page. Emily sat frozen, her face stiff with shock. She whispered, so softly it was like she was speaking to herself. He never loved me. Every time he held me, I thought I was the best thing that ever happened to him. And now, I see I was just the final step in a plan. Just a name in the last line of a lie. I closed my eyes for a moment, then laughed. There was no joy in the sound. He called me his sister, the strict guardian. And you? You were the new happiness, the refuge he ran to while I was breaking my back paying for his insane investments. It's ridiculous. I cried all night when I thought he died. And today, I find out I was nothing but a living piece of financial leverage. Emily bit her lip, reached out and snatched the notebook, flipping quickly through the pages. I saw her eyes stop at the last page. She didn't say a word, just held it up for me to see. A messy line of handwriting sat at the edge of the page, as if it had been added at the very end. Sarah will never find me. Emily clenched her fist and looked up at me. Her eyes no longer trembled. He was wrong. We found him, and this time, I won't stay quiet. I nodded, but what stirred inside me wasn't satisfaction. It was a quiet kind of resolve. We had once stood on opposite sides. Now, our eyes were fixed on the same man, and wherever he was, he would have to face the truth. Face us, and face everything he thought he had erased. That evening, the only light on in the house came from the living room. Emily and I sat across from each other at the wooden table. The room still smelled faintly of fireplace ash, but the warmth was long gone. The tears from earlier had dried on our cheeks, and what remained in our eyes was sharp, steady, and beyond hesitation. Emily spoke first, her voice shaky but clear. "Do you want to take him to court?" I didn't answer right away. I reached for the bottle and poured another glass of wine. The soft clink of the glass touching the table broke the silence. I looked straight at her, my voice steady. Court won't be enough. I want him to lose everything. His reputation, his money, his freedom, and whatever shred of respect he still holds in the eyes of his son. Emily stayed quiet for a moment, then looked down. Her voice faltered. And David Jr. He's always believed his dad was a hero. Every time he came home, he'd tell his friends it was because his dad had to protect the company from bad people. He never once doubted him. I looked at her and spoke slowly, carefully choosing every word. If he knows the truth, he'll decide for himself whose side to take. Children aren't stupid. They just need someone brave enough to show them what's real. Emily nodded. I could see she was no longer the fragile woman I had met that first day. Something in her had cracked open and then closed again beneath a new layer, harder, steadier. I asked, "Do you still have the private number David used to call this place?" She answered, "Yes, but I never called it. He told me not to, said it was for work only, that he didn't want me to disturb him." I said, "Call him, right now. Tell him you're in danger, that someone is lurking around the house, that you're scared, worried about your son, and need him to come back." Emily hesitated, then reached for her phone. Just before dialing, she looked up at me. Her voice was soft, but firm. "If he really comes back, are you sure you won't hesitate?" I didn't answer. I simply raised my glass of wine to my lips and gave a single nod. The phone rang. After the third ring, the line connected. David's voice came through, low and slightly curt. "What's going on?" Emily began to act. "Hey, I'm really scared. There's someone strange walking around the farm. They were looking through the windows. Do you think... could it be someone from Sarah? I'm so worried. I don't know what to do. I think someone is watching us." David went quiet for a moment, then snapped. "Stop. Don't say her name. Has she found something out?" Emily kept going. This time, her voice trembled for real. She didn't need to pretend. "I don't know, but I'm scared. I just want you to come home. I don't want our son to see me like this. He's sleeping now, but if he wakes up and sees me crying..." David took a deep breath. "All right, I'll come back tomorrow morning, but don't tell anyone, especially John. He's monitoring a few stocks for me. No one can know I'm coming back. Do you hear me?" Emily gave a quiet yes, then ended the call. I looked at her and gave a slight nod. My voice was low, but firm. "The trap is set. Now all we have to do is wait for the animal to walk in on its own. And this time, there's no way out." I left the farmhouse that very night, right after the final call with David. Not to run away, but to prepare for the next part, something I knew I couldn't handle alone. I drove for 2 hours straight to the office of a man I had once considered a lifeline, only to forget him in the fog of blind faith. He was a private investigator, someone who had followed David for me a year ago, back when I first started to question those endless business trips and the nights without a single message. I knocked on his door. When he opened it and saw me standing there, a flicker of confusion crossed his face. I spoke slowly. "I need you again. This time, not because of jealousy, but because this is about a life, about dignity, about the law, and about a truth I should have faced long ago." He let me in, sat down, crossed his arms, and leaned back in his chair, watching me carefully. "Do you remember what I told you last time? I said you were being paranoid, but I was wrong. Not because you suspected your husband. I was wrong because I thought he was just a typical cheater. I didn't realize he was the kind of man who could kill without a weapon." I didn't argue. Instead, I laid everything out in front of him: the journal David kept, a copy of the life insurance policy, legal documents tied to the massive loan I was now paying off, and the ownership papers for the farmhouse, which should have been sold 2 years ago, but still listed David's name. I placed each item on the table like evidence in a courtroom. He looked through each item, then gave a silent nod. Every line in the journal made his brow furrow. When he reached the final sentence, "Sarah will never find me," he let out a laugh, but there wasn't a trace of humor in it. "He really thought you'd stay blind forever, didn't he? All right, I'll help you, but this time, we're doing it strictly by the book." I nodded. I didn't need a bitter revenge. I needed the truth to be brought into the light of the law. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with the local sheriff. At first, he was cautious, even skeptical. He asked me to sit down and explain everything in detail. I started with the insurance policy, then handed over the notebook where David had outlined his plan to fake his death, along with proof that he had transferred money to an offshore account under a false name. When he finished reading, the sheriff looked up. His voice no longer carried the calm tone from earlier. "If what you're saying is true, then this isn't just a simple case of insurance fraud. We're talking about organized financial deception, and if there's another person involved in the scheme, this could qualify as a serious federal crime." I replied simply, "I don't care what he's charged with. I just want the truth exposed, and I want the people he used to know exactly who they are." The sheriff gave a firm nod. "We'll be watching his every move the moment he sets foot back in town." That evening, I returned to the farmhouse. Emily had set everything up as if nothing had happened. She made a simple dinner, set the table, fluffed the sofa cushions, swept the front path, and placed a few toys in her son's room. No one looking in from the outside would ever guess that this house was about to become the burial ground of a double life. I stood on the second floor, in a corner untouched by the light, quietly watching her every move. Emily arranged things with ease, but I knew each of her actions was now calculated. She looked up, saw me standing there, then walked to the bottom of the stairs and spoke loud enough for me to hear. "I never thought I'd be the one to deceive him, but I've been deceived long enough," I answered, my voice low. "And today, he'll know what that feels like. Not through angry words, but through silence, through paperwork, through the law, and through the kind of despair that offers no way out." I glanced at the clock. By morning, he would be back, and when he was, we would be ready, not just as two betrayed women, but as witnesses, as the ones who finally saw clearly, and as the ones with nothing left to lose. The sound of a car approaching in the distance cut through the tension that had been building in the house all night. Emily and I looked at each other without speaking, only nodded. We had spent the entire night preparing. Every detail was in place, down to where we'd sit, how we'd look at him, and the first thing we'd say when he walked through that door. The engine stopped right at the front entrance. After a few seconds of silence, the car door opened. The sound of footsteps moved from the concrete path onto the wooden porch. The front door swung open. David appeared. He stepped in with a hurried gait, eyes darting around, a furrow forming on his brow. He had no idea that what waited behind this familiar door had changed completely. "Emily, where are you? Is David Jr. asleep?" No answer came. He called out again, louder this time, but there was already a hint of unease in his voice. I could hear his breathing grow faster. He walked into the living room, eyes scanning the space, guarded, and the moment he saw me sitting on the sofa, he froze in place, his entire body going rigid, his face turned pale, as if he'd just seen a ghost. I stood up slowly, locking eyes with him. "Welcome back from the dead. We're holding a memorial for you. No flowers, no incense, just two women, one who was your wife, one who was your cover story, and one man with nowhere left to hide." David stepped back half a pace, eyes shifting around the room. His voice cracked, scrambling for an excuse. How did you find out? Who let you in here? This house isn't yours." Emily stepped out from the kitchen, hands still dusted with flour from the bread she had pretended to be baking. She stood facing him, her eyes stripped of any warmth. "I did. I invited her. And you? Who are you? The devoted father you told our son about, always busy protecting the company? The perfect husband who said he'd lost his family in the past? Or the man who faked his death to dodge debt, steal insurance money, and rob others of their dignity?" David turned to me, his eyes flickering, mouth open as if to explain. "Sarah, please, let me explain. It's not what you think." I cut him off. "Not what I think? Then tell me, what did I get wrong? Was I wrong to believe your losses were just market-related? Wrong to take on all the debt in my name? Wrong to cry myself to sleep every night thinking you were gone? Or was I just stupid for never imagining my husband had two lives, two families, and one carefully calculated plan to turn me into the fool who'd clean up his mess?" He turned back to Emily. "Baby, I was going to tell you. I just didn't know how. Everything got so complicated. I didn't want to hurt either of you. I was trying to protect you both. I never thought it would go this far." Emily let out a bitter laugh. "Protect me? You faked your death and left me raising a child alone inside a fantasy. You built an entire lie just to run from your responsibilities. Do you really think your son will hold his head high once he finds out who his father truly is?" David took a step forward, voice dropping lower. "I did it because I was out of options. There was no other way. Sarah had all the assets in her name. The insurance could only be paid out if I disappeared. I just needed time. I was going to come back. I was going to make things right. I didn't mean to abandon anyone. I looked at him and sighed. You didn't mean to abandon anyone? But you abandoned everything. Me, her, the child you once called your reason for living. And now you stand here still trying to talk your way out of this like we don't understand what's happening. But you're wrong. Today, we see everything more clearly than ever before. And this time, there's no exit left for you. David stood frozen, unable to speak. The room fell into silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. I knew, at that moment, he had finally felt the one thing he'd spent his whole life running from: the truth. And this time, it was no longer in his control. It was in ours, in the hands of the two women he thought would never find each other. But here we were, and this was the real memorial for the man who had long since died in the eyes of his own conscience. I didn't need to say much. As David began stammering his last desperate justifications, I quietly placed the journal on the table and slid it toward him with two fingertips, like returning something he had clumsily dropped. He glanced at the notebook, then looked up, his eyes wavering as if trying to salvage a trace of the authority he used to command. I stared straight into him, my voice sharp as a freshly honed blade. You should learn how to hide your secrets better. Don't write with ink so bold it bleeds through the page. You left every word like breadcrumbs, almost as if you wanted me to find them, and I didn't disappoint your carelessness. He swallowed hard, beads of sweat starting to form on his temples. This doesn't prove anything. It's just speculation. I wrote those lines to blow off steam. People fantasize, don't they? I didn't get a chance to respond before the door behind him opened. Two uniformed officers entered, followed by a plainclothes detective. The man in front held up a warrant. His voice was clear, firm, and left no room for argument. David Walker, you are under arrest for insurance fraud, financial deception, and falsification of legal documents. You need to come with us immediately. David sprang up, knocking his hand against the table, stumbling a step back, his eyes darting around, desperate for a way out. You're making a mistake. This is a setup. I'm being framed. I have a lawyer. I'll sue all of you. Then he turned toward me. Sarah, you can't do this to me. We're married, after everything we've been through. Are you really going to bury me for good? I just looked at him without a word. The two officers stepped forward and cuffed his hands behind his back. As the cold metal tightened around his wrists, I saw his shoulders collapse, like someone had struck the back of his neck. At that moment, David Jr. opened his bedroom door and stepped out, rubbing his eyes in confusion. His son stood there, holding a small teddy bear, staring at the scene before him, unable to make sense of it. Emily quickly rushed over, knelt down, and wrapped her arms around him. She smoothed his hair and spoke softly, but firmly. Sweetheart, your father isn't the hero you thought he was. He's a lesson for you to learn the difference between truth and lies, and you will learn so you never become someone like him. David lowered his head, unable to meet anyone's gaze. I stood still for a moment, then turned and walked toward the door. As my hand touched the handle, I paused. Without looking back, I spoke loud enough for him to hear. You once wrote that I would never find you, but in the end, I didn't have to. You came back on your own. The door opened. The first breeze of the season drifted in, cool and clear. I stepped outside, not triumphant, not angry, just calm. Because sometimes an ending doesn't need to be dramatic. It just needs to be just. And this time, justice had arrived, at the right place, at the right time, and for exactly the right person. 3 months later, the preliminary hearing was held in a small local courtroom. I didn't sit in the front row, nor did I show up with a triumphant face. I sat in the back, next to Emily, her hand gently holding mine in a quiet reassurance we both needed. David sat on the defendant's bench, dressed in gray prison uniform, wrists cuffed, face sunken, hair streaked with gray, eyes void of the fire once carried by a man who thought he could control 2 lives. There were no reporters outside that courtroom. Not a single old friend of his showed up. Even the defense attorney didn't bother pretending to show him any respect. I overheard whispers that, after everything came to light, everyone who had ever worked with him, done business with him, or even known him, quietly erased his name from their contacts. His Cayman account was frozen. Former investors filed lawsuits. Insurance companies blacklisted him permanently. The worst part was the little boy. In the 3 months David had been in custody, he had written more than 10 letters to David Jr. Not one of them was opened. Emily didn't forbid it, and I didn't interfere. It was the boy's choice. He didn't cry, didn't ask questions. When he said, "I want to change my last name," Emily and I looked at each other, then nodded. We didn't teach him to hate his father. We only showed him what was real and what was false. And he chose on his own. After the trial, Emily and I sat down for coffee just outside the town. The cafe was tucked under a canopy of oak trees, with soft, golden sunlight and a breeze gentle enough for me to finally let out a quiet sigh. Emily looked at me and asked, "Do you feel lighter now?" I nodded. Not because he was arrested, but because I finally know I wasn't crazy. The instincts I kept trying to silence, the dreams I thought were nightmares, they were all warnings. I heard them too late, but not too late. Emily smiled. I used to think I'd never trust anyone again, but now I know I can trust at least one person, you. I looked at her and spoke slowly. We once loved the same man. Now we've learned how to let go of the same man. We didn't become soulmates. We didn't start calling each other sisters. But we both knew that in this winding life, there had been a stretch of road where we held hands and walked through the mud. And neither of us slipped again. As for David, he's still alive. In a remote prison no one bothers to mention. He didn't die. But to the world, he's been dead for a long time. A death that needed no coffin. A funeral no one attended. And a man no longer called by name. Only 3 words remain: Inmate Walker. That was the price for someone who thought he could bury 2 women under a pile of lies. But in the end, he dug his own grave, and we, instead of crying, simply looked at each other and walked away, with freedom and the truth. This isn't just the downfall of a liar. It's the rise of 2 women who were once seen as fragile, and when they stood on the same side, nothing could stay hidden for long. If you've ever been betrayed, if you've ever fallen for the wrong person and questioned everything you believed, I hope you remember this. You are not alone. And sometimes, the sweetest revenge is simply the truth spoken at the right moment. If this story resonated with you, leave a comment to share your thoughts. Hit the like button to support the creator, and subscribe to Revenge Diary so you won't miss the next chapter. Because some lessons are only learned when you've lost everything, but still found the strength to rise and keep walking.